Hello, everyone, and welcome back for some more Drag Race gossip, secrets, and drama. So I'm back for another Have Your Say video, and this video is for Canada versus the World Season 2, Episode 4. You may have seen that I did post on my channel that I was unfortunately sick for the last few weeks, so I did miss episodes 2 and 3 of this season, and I feel like it's maybe a bit late to go back and do them, so I'm just going to skip over them, which is why I'm going to just continue on to episode 4. So if you're wondering, there are no episodes 2 and 3. Sorry. So in this video, we're going to be recapping this week's episode, going through the results of the Have Your Say poll, and I'll be talking about a little bit of drama to do with Miss Fiercalicious calling out production after this week's episode. All that and more coming up in today's video, so let's get started. Okay, so let's start by recapping this week's episode. So the queens come back into the workroom after Tynomi's elimination, and of course they're very sad because a Canadian girl is now gone. And I thought it was kind of interesting that there was a little bit of a shady moment where Cheryl, who obviously won the lip sync, was saying she gave everything and she was dancing, and Kennedy was saying, oh, that wasn't dancing, that was pointing. And it didn't really seem to make much of it, but I thought that was just kind of a funny, shady moment. And then something else interesting that happened was that Miss Fiercalicious apologized for how she had acted earlier in Untucked about being ungrateful that she was in the top but didn't win. And we'll talk about this in a little bit because there is some backstage tea to do with this that Miss Fiercalicious talked about on Twitter, but I'll talk about that at the end of the video. Okay, so the queens come back into the workroom the next day and they find out that they have to do a mini challenge called Sink or Swim, which is where they have to do some kind of lip sync. And they go onto a different stage and then we find out that they have to do a lip sync while they're also having things thrown at them such as streamers, bits of fabric, feathers, and then at the end there were also some blow up dolls. I thought this was a really fun mini challenge because I like that they're switching it up. It wasn't just something normal that they do. It wasn't just a regular lip sync. I liked that they did something a little bit unexpected. And it was really funny to see how the queens were reacting to all of this stuff that was just being thrown at them. I do think a few of them didn't really seem to know the lyrics to the song. It is quite a difficult song because there are a lot of lyrics, but I do agree that I think Miss Fiercalicious did the best job because every time they showed her, she seemed to know the lyrics and she also seemed to be coping quite well with whatever they were throwing at her, quite literally. And so, perhaps unsurprisingly, they later then reveal that Miss Fiercalicious won the mini challenge. So they find out that the maxi challenge for this week is a roast battle. So it's kind of a bit like a roast and a reading challenge, but it's a reading battle between two queens. And this is interesting because we've never really had something like this before. We've had roasts and we've had the reading challenge, but this is kind of like the two together plus the fact that it's almost a bit like a lip sync in the sense that obviously the queens are having to battle against each other. So because Miss Fiercalicious won the mini challenge, she gets to pick her opponent and she picks Lemon, which does make sense because they're both Canadian queens, so they have some history. Lemon then gets to pick the next queen to pick and she picks Cheryl, and Cheryl picks Eureka for her partner. And so that means that the remaining two who are a pair are Alexis and Kennedy. And I thought these pairings were quite fair. I think it kind of matched their energies, and I do think that it was quite a good pairing, so I wasn't mad at that. We then obviously see that the queens have to write their jokes, and then they do the thing where they go onto the main stage, and they had a guest judge as well as Brad, who were kind of coaching them. The only thing about these parts I find in all of the roast and comedy challenges is that the queens come on to do this rehearsal thing with the sort of the experts, but my issue is they always seem to give their best material and they show that during the rehearsal. So it then means that it's not quite as funny when the queens reuse it actually during the challenge on the main stage. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I wish that they just cut out that section because it never really adds anything. It's obviously just a bit of time filler because they don't necessarily really show that much of an accurate representation of what the queens are like. We all know that if they show a queen bombing, it means that they're probably going to do well in the actual challenge and vice versa. Okay, so let's move on to the actual reading roast battle. So the first pair that came up were Miss Fiercalicious and Lemon. I really liked this. This was actually my favorite pairing, of my personal opinion. I think both Fierce and Lemon had some really good reads, and I think their banter back and forward maybe felt the most authentic in a way. It didn't feel too forced like maybe some of the others. I do think that Lemon had the edge. I really loved it when she did the joke where she said that Miss Fiercalicious is like Kennedy's eyes, beautiful but lazy. That was such a funny read because people always talk about Kennedy's lazy eyes, and Kennedy also found it funny. And the reason I think it was so good was because it was kind of a 2-for-1 joke, because it wasn't just a joke at Miss Fiercalicious's expense, but also bringing Kennedy into the joke as well. And I think that was a really good idea because not many queens really did that. They tend to focus on just their partner. And I think you can occasionally bring in someone else because it does make it a bit funnier because it adds another dimension to it as well. I also thought that Lemon's bantering back and forward and her sort of off the cuff responses were really good as well. And I think she bantered really well with Miss Fiercalicious and also the judges as well. So that's why, to me, I think she had the edge in this pairing. I did really like, though, when Miss Fiercalicious said to Lemon, she could say that her drag is basic and unimaginative and you're going home, but I think hearing that from RuPaul was enough. And that was obviously a reference to when Lemon was sent home first on UK versus the World. That was definitely a highlight of me from the whole thing as well. So I do think Miss Fiercalicious, although I think she was maybe not quite as confident as Lemon, I still think she did a really good job. One thing I did notice, though, is, and this goes for all of them, I thought it was a little bit weird that they did the judges' critiques right after each pair had performed. And to me, it just felt a little bit awkward because it was just so soon after the performance. It kind of felt a little bit awkward, especially because the audience and everything was still there. They don't normally do this. They tend to do judges' critiques after everyone's gone and after the runway and things like that. I would have preferred it if everyone had gone and then they did the judges' critiques afterwards. But let me know if you found that a little bit awkward or you actually liked that they did it that way. So the next pairing was Cheryl and Eureka. I really enjoyed these two. I think Cheryl really set the tone when they were walking onto stage. Cheryl said, "Keep up." I thought that was just so funny, and it really showed that Cheryl was really gunning for the win this week. And I thought Cheryl in general, between the two of them, was probably the more confident and the funnier one of the two. I really loved her jokes. I mean, we already heard the one in the rehearsal about Eureka making the CN Tower looking like a toothpick. It's a funny joke, but we kind of heard it before, so I didn't find that one as funny. I thought Eureka did an okay job, but she definitely seemed in her head. She had a couple of funny reads, but it didn't quite flow as well for me. I think Cheryl was, to me, the standout between the two. And then the last pairing was Kennedy and Alexis. I thought this was a very good pairing because you can tell that the queens really respect each other and they're friends, but you can also tell that they're used to doing that sort of thing and snipping at each other. And it felt like I was watching queens at the drag brunch or something. So it felt a very funny performance in general. It's difficult to decide, I think, who did better. I think perhaps Kennedy, she had maybe some more jokes, but I personally didn't quite get the thing about the hair falling off. I mean, it was funny, but I wasn't sure if maybe I was just missing a reference. I guess because she was saying, because Alexis was saying her hairline is so far back. But I think at the beginning it was quite funny, but after a while, I feel like it kind of got a little bit messy with some of the reads kind of going over the top of each other and things. It was still funny, but to me, yeah, it maybe wasn't as good, I thought, as Lemon and Miss Fiercalicious's, which felt a little bit more polished, but still very funny to watch the two of them going backwards and forwards. And I think they both got in enough good jokes. And I can see why they were so well received, because it was very funny and it kind of felt like there was a mutual respect that they were able to do that while still being very funny. So we find out that the top three for this week are Lemon, Cheryl, and Kennedy. And Kennedy overall wins the challenge. So because Kennedy won, she gets the power of the Golden Beaver, which means that she gets to save one of the bottom three. And on the main stage, we find out that she chooses to save Alexis. And what I thought was really interesting about the kind of untucked moment was that Miss Fiercalicious actually said she didn't want the Golden Beaver because she wanted to prove and fight for her place, which I thought was a really interesting and strategic thing to do. And it definitely made the episode feel a bit more interesting. So that means that Miss Fiercalicious lip syncs against Eureka to the song Hush Hush by the Pussycat Dolls. And Miss Fiercalicious is announced as the winner of the lip sync, which means that Eureka unfortunately gets told to sashay away. Okay, so let's move on to the results of the Have Your Say poll. So, question 1 was, who did the best in the mini challenge? And with 55.5% was Miss Fiercalicious, followed by Lemon with 15.7, and then Kennedy Davenport with 12.9. As I said earlier, I also agree that Miss Fiercalicious, I think, did the best. She looked like she knew every lyric from what we saw, but she also seemed to kind of take it in her stride when they were throwing God knows what at her. And I think she was really funny, and she was really, doing the splits and the dips and all the other things. And I think some of the other queens maybe got a little bit distracted. So I do think that Miss Fiercalicious deserved the win for this one. Question 2 was, who would you pick as your roast/reading partner? And with 32.3%, we had Miss Fiercalicious, 22.6% for Eureka, and then 16.3% for Cheryl. And I agree, I think I probably also would have picked Miss Fiercalicious just because I think there's probably the most to go on because she's got one of the bigger personalities on the show. And because she's had quite a few moments where she was being petulant, I think that really gives you quite a lot of fodder and ammunition to go with. So I think I probably would have picked Miss Fiercalicious as well. Question 3 was, which pair was the funniest? And with 45.4%, we had Kennedy and Alexis. And then Lemon and Miss Fiercalicious with 42.4%, and then Cheryl and Eureka with 12.3%. As I said earlier, I personally would have given it to Lemon and Miss Fiercalicious as the top spot. There was not that much difference between the two, but I do think that theirs was maybe just slightly cleaner in that sense. I did feel that although Alexis and Kennedy were really funny, I did think it got a little bit messy, but maybe that was the point, I don't know. But I didn't quite get the thing with the hair, and they kept going back and forward. It kind of felt a little bit less cohesive, but still very funny. So I do agree that those two were the better two out of the groups. And unfortunately, Cheryl and Eureka were probably the weakest. Question 4 was, do you agree with the top 3? And we had 86% for yes and 14% for no. So a pretty strong result for yes. And I personally agree. I did think that each person who won their respective battle did deserve it, and it was the result that I said as I was watching it. So none of them were really that much of a surprise. I think it was kind of obvious that the queens who were in the bottom maybe were just slightly less confident or didn't quite get as many jokes out as the 3 that were in the top. But it was still pretty close in most instances. Question 5 was, who was the funniest overall and should have won? And we had Lemon with 41.9%, Kennedy Davenport with 26.7%, and then Cheryl with 25.8%. So this is quite interesting because Lemon actually got the biggest proportion of the votes, yet obviously Kennedy won in the episode. And I also agree, I personally would have given it to Lemon because I think she had the funniest jokes and she had the best mix of jokes, but also then volleying back with other people, including the judges, and hers felt the most natural. But it's interesting because obviously people were saying that they thought that Kennedy and Alexis were the top group overall, but then Kennedy didn't get the most votes for who should win overall. So that's kind of interesting. And then in terms of Cheryl, she came third in this vote. And I also agree. I actually thought she was probably one of the funnier ones because she really had some very quick comebacks to pretty much everything that everyone said. So I do think she should have got more credit than she did in the episode. Question 6 was, who had the best outfit during the challenge? And we had Miss Fiercalicious with 42.2%, Lemon with 21.7%, and then Alexis Mateer with 17.6%. And this was a very interesting category. And the reason I put it there is because we didn't have a runway. So, and we will talk about this in a little bit, but because there was no runway, it did feel quite random because it looked as though there was some theme for the outfits, although they didn't tell us. And it was very kind of almost a bit showgirly and things like that, which is a bit random to do a roast battle in because some of them looked like they were in lip sync outfits, whereas someone like Miss Fiercalicious, that was obviously not a lip sync outfit. So it is quite difficult to judge and compare those different types of outfits. But yeah, I would agree that I think for me, I really liked Miss Fiercalicious because the outfit was just so extravagant and interesting. I also quite liked Cheryl's because it kind of looked like a ringleader and that kind of worked in terms of roast master and things like that. I actually thought that was maybe an underappreciated look in my opinion. Question 7 was, who would you have saved with the Golden Beaver? And with 60.9% was Alexis Mateo, followed by Miss Fiercalicious with 24.3, and then Eureka with 14.8. I agree because, as I've said before, if I was doing the Golden Beaver, I would probably do it in a fair way, and I think I would do it based on who I thought was the best in the challenge. And I do think out of the 3 who were in the bottom, Alexis was the strongest. So I also would have picked to save Alexis. Interesting, though, that people have voted more for Miss Fiercalicious rather than Eureka, even though Miss Fiercalicious said she didn't want the beaver. And I do agree. I think out of Eureka and Miss Fiercalicious probably did better in the challenge, but because she said she didn't want it, to me, I automatically just wouldn't have given it to her. Question 8 was, who won the lip sync? And with the vast majority of 92% was Miss Fiercalicious, with Eureka only getting 8%. And I think this was pretty obvious. Miss Fiercalicious did a really good job. She really proved herself as a performer because we haven't necessarily seen that much of that side of her yet. And I think she really embodied the song. She really had lots of different tricks and splits and things ready to do. And I do think, unfortunately, Eureka looked like she had kind of checked out a little bit. We'll discuss that in a little bit when we talk about the comments, but I do think it was unfortunately her time to go. And I do think that Miss Fiercalicious did better in the lip sync. And then finally, question 9 was, who is the front runner, or in other words, most likely to win the competition? And with 67.5% was Lemon, followed by Kennedy Davenport with 19.4%, and then Alexis Mateo with 9%. And from what we've seen, I would have to agree. I think Lemon has probably been the strongest overall so far. She hasn't really done a bad job in any of the challenges, and I think they are putting this narrative of her being very confident and she's really good at everything, but she's also coming back for the 3rd time to prove herself. But let me know in the comments what you think. Which queen do you think is going to win, and why do you think they're going to win? Okay, so let's move on to the comments for this week. So my first comment comes from my Patreon member Amy, who said, I felt a certain way about Kennedy winning the episode, to be honest. First, I thought Alexis was the better of the 2, and then I thought Lemon was the best overall. This isn't shade to Kennedy at all, she is great, but I think this served the overall storyline better, having Eureka and Fierce lip sync against each other. I thought this was a really interesting comment because I hadn't necessarily thought about that last part about the storyline works better with Miss Fiercalicious and Eureka lip syncing, but that does make sense. And I do think Lemon did better overall. So if it was my decision, I would have given the win to her. Kennedy was also good, but to me, I really thought that Lemon was going to win this. Amy also followed this up with another comment that said, and also, it is my opinion that a Canadian queen has to win this season because a US queen won season 1 compared to UK versus the World, where UK queens have won both of their respective seasons. My vote goes to Lemon winning the season overall as a redemption for her aborted run on UK versus the World. I agree that Lemon looks like she's the front runner, and because it does fit the narrative of a Canadian queen winning Canada versus the World, because obviously last season Raja O'Hara from the US won it. I don't know if they really take that into account and whether they really care about which country the queen comes from, because it's just an all-stars at the end of the day. But it will be interesting to see how that narrative progresses, because if Lemon does win, then I think that does give some credence to this theory. But let me know in the comments what you think. Do you think they actually care who wins and from what country they're from, or do you think it doesn't really matter? My Patreon Linda commented saying, I agree with you, Amy. Kennedy is one of my favourite queens ever, but Lemon's clapbacks were better. And I did say this earlier, I do think that one of the major reasons for me that I thought Lemon was the best this week was because she felt the most natural and had the most clapbacks, whereas I think Kennedy was maybe funnier in a different way, but she was probably sticking to the script a little bit more. So that's to me why I also agree that although I think Kennedy is an incredible queen, I think Lemon won this week. Okay, so moving on to some of the comments from the Have Your Say poll. And someone said, honestly, really thought this was Cheryl's week, especially with the comeback she gave with Eureka and then the witty comeback with Brooklyn. The comeback where she said that she looked like Lord Farquaad, I thought that was so funny and was arguably one of the funniest bits of the entire performance, even though it wasn't actually technically part of the performance. So yeah, I do think that Cheryl's not quite getting the props and the credit that she's due. I am wondering, because obviously Cheryl has never won anything on Drag Race. She's very much, she always jokes about, another week of me doing mediocre is her line that she said. I do wonder if she's going to get the Jan or the Lucy LaDuca edit where they're kind of pushing them every week to think they're going to win and then they don't. And I don't know if it's because they just want to see them crack a little bit or whether it's just circumstance that queen just doesn't win. Because I also felt like Cheryl should have maybe won in episode 2 when they did that acting improv challenge. And I was a bit surprised that she didn't get the win for that one. So yeah, I'm just wondering if there's something there. Let me know in the comments. Do you think they're trying to make her have a kind of face crack moment like Jan? Or do you think that all of the wins so far and Cheryl not winning was deserved? And someone else followed this up with something similar, saying, production keeps snubbing Cheryl. There have been a couple of challenges already where a win could have been justified for her, and it makes me sad because she's doing really well this season, in my opinion. And then finally, someone talked about Eureka in the comments, and this came up quite a few times. Someone said, I felt like Eureka was just going through the motions. This was probably in part because of her sobriety journey. She's a fabulous queen and love seeing her grow. She just needs time to figure out who she is sober. I thought this was a really good point, and they did talk about this in this episode. They focused on her sobriety and how that's changed her as a person. And, good for her for being sober, very important journey, and I'm really glad that she's in that place in her life. And she also talked about obviously transitioning, and I think that must be so difficult on top of sobriety at the same time. If we compare Eureka in her original seasons to now, I do think you can see that she does seem to be in her head a lot more, and she's not quite as big a personality as she was on the original seasons. So this was a very interesting comment because I do also kind of agree. It did look like Eureka had slightly checked out a little bit. And I do think perhaps maybe she wasn't quite in the right headspace. So it's a shame that she came back and she didn't quite feel it. So I hope that she's doing better now, and maybe we'll see her on another All Stars, who knows. But yeah, I do think unfortunately it was her time to go. So I hope that she's in a better place now than she was when they filmed this. Okay, so now let's move on to a little bit of light drama that happened this week to do with Miss Fiercalicious calling out production. As we know, Miss Fiercalicious has brought the drama on her seasons, and she's very good TV. And for those of you who are not following her on Twitter/X, you may not have seen that she has actually tweeted quite a lot of backstage teen information on X, but also she's called out production quite a few times. And I was going to talk about this in my previous Have Your Says, but because I was sick, I didn't do them. So I'm just going to go through the episodes so far, and I'm just going to say which episode I'm talking about and then what Miss Fierce has said about it, because there has been quite a few times that she's spilt some quite interesting information, or there's been a little bit of a fight between some of the queens on X. Okay, so going back to episode 1, and you might remember that the queen who went home that week was La Cayena. And during Untucked, there was obviously the bit where LaPhil was kind of supporting La Cayena, and LaPhil said, in Untucked, I was the first to advocate to keep my babe Cayena, as I thought she had way more to show. So that's why Fia says to save Cayena too. I said, why does it sound so much shadier coming from you? And Miss Fiercalicious responded to this and said, the way this never happened. LaPhil then said, yes it did, but you don't listen. Miss Fiercalicious then responded by tagging every other queen from the season and just said, y'all remember this happening, ? LaPhil then said, Lemon asked all of us who we'd save, and I said Cayena has more to show. You literally see me follow up and ask you, why does it sound so shady when you say it like that? Miss Fiercalicious joked that they must all have amnesia except for LaPhil, and she said, I waited the entire Untucked for someone to say save La Cayena, but no one did, so that's why I did myself at the end. If you had brought it up first, I definitely would have pitched in. And LaPhil obviously doesn't seem to believe Miss Fiercalicious and said, I have excellent memory, babes. I said what I said, but you loved the clout. We went round the sofa, hence you were last in commenting on it all. Roll the unaired and get my producer on here now. And it seems that Miss Fiercalicious then asked Lemon about this in a text message, because Miss Fiercalicious posted what looked like a screenshot of a text message from Lemon, and she'd asked Lemon whether she remembers this happening, and Lemon just said, I don't remember that happening, honestly. LaFille then said, lol at your memories, there was a lot said in Untucked, so I totally understand if y'all forgot, but I know what I said and the fact I discussed it in the confessionals too. La Cayena also responded to this and said, no shade, I don't. As in, I don't remember this happening. And this I thought was kind of interesting. And then LaFille said, gay gasp, even my confessional producer remembered too. I spoke about it in my confessionals. So I guess we'll never know, but I just thought this was obviously a funny exchange. And as we can see in the messages, I don't think this is serious. They were using the laughing emojis, but it was just kind of funny to see the queens having a real-time conversation about this in a kind of shady way. So I just thought this was something interesting, and it gave some context to what happened in episode 1. Okay, so episode 2, which was when they had to do the improv challenge, something I saw that was quite interesting was that Miss Fiercalicious tweeted a photo of her from when she competed on the Traitors Canada. And I knew that she had been on the Traitors because obviously I'm a Drag Race fan and I know everything about all of the queens. And I was a bit curious as well why they weren't mentioning it, because this is challenge that they did, this improv challenge, was basically the Traitors. It was quite clearly based on that, but they didn't mention it at all. So I did wonder whether it was something to do with licensing or copyright or something like that. But Miss Fiercalicious tweeted a photo of her on the Traitors and then also a photo of her from the challenge. And she said, the way I was literally on the Traitors and the whole discussion got removed from the episode. And then she had a middle finger and then it says Canada. And then someone in the comments said something quite interesting and said, it doesn't even make sense why they'd remove it because both are owned by Bell Media. And Miss Fiercalicious said that part, as in she was agreeing. And it is unusual because Bell Media is the overall company that owns both Drag Race and also the Traitors. So there shouldn't really have been any kind of copyright issue or anything like that. So it is curious as to why they didn't mention anything about Miss Fiercalicious being on a show that was clearly the inspiration for the challenge. But I just thought this was kind of interesting that Miss Fiercalicious was bringing this up. Okay, so moving on to episode 3, which was the ball challenge. One of the things that went kind of unexpectedly viral from this was Lemon's outfit where she was dressed as a cat and it had kind of mirrors on the outfit. And you may remember that in Untucked, there was a little bit of a shady moment when Miss Fiercalicious kind of made a comment about Lemon, saying that that outfit, the cat outfit, was just from Amazon. And then Lemon kind of clapped back and said, oh, well, your wings from your outfit were also from Amazon. But this conversation then kind of went on to Twitter, and a lot of people were talking about this and saying how it's from Amazon. And Miss Fiercalicious tweeted about this, and she posted a photo of the actual Amazon listing with this outfit and said, the reason I went off on Lemon in Untucked was because Brad said this look was going to go down in Drag Race history as one of the best looks of all time, which got cut. Nothing wrong with buying things online, but going down in history for it. So I responded, let me resubscribe to Amazon so I can go down in history too, which also got cut. And we can see on the Amazon listing that this is actually not a cheap outfit. It's $890, but it is still from Amazon. And Lemon responded to Miss Fiercalicious tweeting about this Amazon link and said that she actually contacted the maker of this outfit directly and worked with them to create the outfit. But Miss Fiercalicious clapped back and kind of made a joke saying, oh, well, the only thing you changed was putting lights in the eyes. And Lemon also joked and said that she loved Miss Fiercalicious's wrinkly outfit, referring to the hat in Miss Fiercalicious's design challenge look. And Miss Fiercalicious followed this up by making quite a few jokes about things. So, for example, she tweeted about Rita Baga and Boa's outfits from season 1, which a lot of people also at the time said they were confused why those were such high looks. And she also posted about Kendall Jenner's hips compared to Lemon's outfit with the hips. So it was obviously just a kind of jokey backwards and forwards, but I just thought it was kind of funny that Miss Fiercalicious is clearly bringing the drama, but it's quite entertaining to see the queens having these discussions because we're also learning some backstage information about the outfits and how everything works. And Miss Fiercalicious also said from this episode that she thought the editing was shady because she said she did cheer for Alexis when she won, but then they used a shot of Miss Fiercalicious looking annoyed. And Lemon made the point of just saying that it's okay that the queens are kind of clapping back and having fun with each other, but it's not okay for the fans to also get involved and be mean. And then finally, for this week, Miss Fiercalicious tweeted about the fact that there was no runway this week, which is something that was a bit unusual because there does tend to be a runway for every single episode. And Miss Fiercalicious tweeted saying, I kind of feel they took out the runways, plus the judges critiquing us on the runways, to justify Kennedy's win. Don't get me wrong, Kennedy killed the challenge and had us all in stitches, but Cheryl lost the improv challenge because of her runway, yet Kennedy wins in a bodysuit. Someone also asked if there was a theme for this week's outfits, and Miss Fiercalicious clarified that the category was Razzle Dazzle, which does make sense if you look at the outfits. Miss Fiercalicious also tweeted the full look because she said that there were certain bits that she couldn't have on the runway because she then couldn't hold her cue cards, so she showed the full look. Miss Fiercalicious also said that she has anxiety and she let that anxiety get to her in this week's challenge, which was the roast/reading challenge, but she's still very proud of her performance. She also called out production and she said, I'm honestly so furious over this episode, and it's because our runways were not shown properly, so I guess look at our Instagrams to see the complete looks. Miss Fiercalicious followed this up by saying, usually I get mad at the cast after the episodes, but tonight I'm mostly furious at production. How dare you not air our runways tonight? Some of us spent a lot of money on our runways and they deserve to be showcased. I'm like actually not over this. This is the first time where I agree everyone did really well in the challenge and the bull bleep moment for us not getting to showcase our subways. I think she means runways. Especially after we were told they'd get shown. Miss Fierce also tweeted something which I believe has now been deleted. She said, B, let me cuss at Canada's Drag Race right now. Why would you not air our runways that most of us spent a lot of money on? The looks we wore during the challenge were our runways, but we did walk with them too. And so in general, it does look like Miss Fiercalicious was a bit annoyed at production, and it was quite interesting that she called them out so openly on Twitter/X. So it will be interesting to see if she carries on with that and whether that's okay. But it was interesting because it does give us an insight into how the queens are feeling and also some of maybe the backstage stuff that happens. So there you go. There was the Have Your Say for Canada vs. the World Season 2, Episode 4. Let me know what you thought about this new style of reading/roast challenge and whether it was better than a traditional roast or a traditional reading challenge. And who do you think is going to win the season overall? Let me know in the comments. And if you'd like to have your comment featured in my Have Your Say video, please consider subscribing to my Patreon. It just costs a few dollars a month and it really helps support my channel. You'll also get great benefits such as early access to my videos, priority when submitting interview questions, and you'll also get access to the full uncut versions of my interviews as well. And I'll put a link in the description if you'd like to check it out. I'd also like to say thank you so much to my existing Patreons. You are all incredible. I'm so thankful for all of your support every month. Seeing you there is just so amazing. And to have you supporting me this way is really touching. So thank you all so much. And please make sure you hit the subscribe button because it really does help support my channel. Thanks for watching and I hope you'll join me again in some future videos. Thank you. Bye.